They thought he was invisible, just another old man pushing a mop, until the stock ticker froze, and every screen in the building showed his name as the majority shareholder. The janitor didn't say a word. He just turned, and the entire board realized they had been mocking the man who owned their fate. Welcome back to Wealthnaire family, where true power stays quiet, until it's time to speak. The smell of engine oil and fresh paint hung in the air as the bright lights of the Adams Automotive showroom gleamed off polished chrome. A cluster of executives in sleek suits laughed lightly as an old janitor pushed through the glass doors with a mop bucket that squeaked on the marble. His cap was frayed at the brim, his coverall darkened by years of stains, yet his eyes held a calm that didn't match his clothes. He paused beneath the giant emblem, Adams Automotive International, as if greeting an old friend. A chuckle rippled behind him. Someone clapped. Someone pointed. "Careful, old-timer," a man grinned. "Don't scratch the wheels you can't afford." He glanced once at the trucks lined like silent sentinels, then lowered his gaze to the floor he'd come to clean. Richard Hale, the CEO, stood with his arms crossed, an amused smile tugging at his lips. Beside him, HR Director Clara Voss whispered something that made the sales directors burst into louder laughter. Their fingers pointed, not in playful jest, but in mockery, sharp, unkind, dismissive. Johnston Adams said nothing. He simply adjusted the mop handle in his hand. Those close enough to notice would have seen something odd. His grip was firm, precise, not with the shakiness of age, but the steadiness of a man who had tightened bolts on engines more powerful than the machines before them. A mechanic across the room, young, with oil on his sleeves, paused mid-step. His eyes narrowed. The old man had just flipped a small hidden latch on the wall with his elbow, cutting off a hydraulic test cycle before it sputtered. It was a move only someone who knew the building's heartbeat would make. The mechanic opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated as Richard threw him a warning glance. "Sir," Clara called mockingly. "The cleaning staff usually enters from the side door. This area is restricted. These vehicles are for clients, not observers." Johnston didn't look at her. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn cloth. With quiet precision, he wiped a faint smudge off the front emblem of the newest model. His reflection shone back at him, wrinkles, gray beard, eyes that had seen decades of progress and betrayal. For a split second, those eyes softened, as if remembering something long buried. Julia Bennett, a junior accountant standing near the front desk, frowned at the scene. She clutched a stack of files to her chest. Slowly, as the laughter continued, she approached the janitor and slipped a pack of gloves onto his cart. "Mind your wrists," she whispered. "Those handles are rough." Johnston looked up just long enough to meet her eyes. He gave a single nod, silent, grateful, acknowledging her humanity in a room that had forgotten its meaning. Behind them, mounted high on the wall, was the founder's display, 4 portraits enshrined in glass. One of them had a dusty corner, the name partially hidden. Hanston Adams, the rest unreadable. No one looked at it anymore. It had become wall decor, decoration for a legacy they no longer cared about. A sharp voice cut the air. "Security," Richard said, his tone bored. "Escort the custodian to the back. We have a VIP visit at 11. We can't have distractions." A guard approached, hesitant. "Sir, maybe he's cleared." "He's a janitor," Clara snapped, "not a shareholder." Johnston remained silent. He placed the cloth back into his pocket, stepped forward, and gently pressed his palm against the chrome badge of the nearest truck. It was the first model the company had ever made in that facility. The one he had designed. Under his breath, so low only the machine could hear, he whispered, "Still breathes." Richard scoffed. "What would you know about engines?" Johnston finally looked up, not at Richard, but at the emblem. His expression didn't change. His voice, when it came, was calm. "More than you ever will." A hush fell. For a breath, the world stood still around that chrome badge. Richard's mocking grin faded into something uncertain, and Julia's eyes widened with a realization she could not yet name. But Johnston had already turned away, mop in hand, moving toward the service corridor. As he walked, the steady hum of the building seemed to shift. The polished floors beneath his boots were new, the glass walls replaced every 5 years. But beneath all of it, the heartbeat of this place was still his. And with each step, memories stirred, years faded. The polished tiles became cracked concrete. The air smelled not of cologne and leather seating, but of diesel, sweat, and hot steel. A younger Johnston Adams, sleeves rolled, eyes burning with vision, stood in a tin-roofed garage no bigger than a barn. Sparks flew as his welding torch traced life into a steel frame. On the workbench lay a chalk drawing labeled Eden Line, his dream. The world's first affordable, fuel-efficient, long-haul motor that could conquer deserts and ice roads alike. "John," a soft voice called. His wife, Mara, stepped in, balancing sandwiches on a tin tray. Her eyes, brown and kind, held everything the world had ever denied him. Belief. "Eat before it gets cold," she said, brushing sawdust from his hair. Behind her entered 3 men, veterans, discharged with scars both seen and unseen. They had nowhere else to go. Johnston welcomed them not as workers, but as brothers. A teenager followed, a runaway mechanic prodigy who had been sleeping behind a gas station. This was not a company. This was a resurrection. They worked through nights as storms rattled the roof, laughing, singing old road songs, fixing engines from scrap piles. Every dented wrench, every bolt tightened by hand, held a promise. Build something that lifts the forgotten. The day Victor Hale arrived, everything changed. Victor, charming, sharply dressed, extended a checkbook and a contract. "I'll take you global," he promised. "Mass production, worldwide distribution. Just sign." Johnston agreed, but only with iron clauses inserted quietly into the contract. Legacy employment rights. Founders' dignity protection. "This company will never fire the people who built it," Johnston said firmly. "No matter how big we grow." Victor smiled politely, but his eyes said otherwise. Then came the darkest year. A fire ripped through the original factory. Some called it an accident. Johnston did not believe in coincidences, especially not when Victor emerged with press statements and pre-written obituaries. "Visionary founder lost in tragic explosion," the newspapers read. Mara fell ill shortly after. Hospital machines beeped in dim rooms as Johnston, bandaged from the blast, sat by her side in secret. Only a handful knew he was alive. "Don't go back yet," Mara whispered weakly. "Not until their masks fall." He took her hand, tears silently tracing through soot on his face. "I'll return," he vowed. "Only when I know who deserves to stay." The Aegis Trust was born in a quiet bank office. Johnston transferred 51% ownership into a sealed trust, tied to very specific triggers. Any attempt to erase legacy roles, including janitorial or maintenance, would hand full operational control back to him. Victor never read the fine print. Johnston leaned against a supply shelf in the service corridor, watching the HR control screen. A memo flickered to life. Phase 1. Implementation. Replace janitorial and maintenance with automated systems, effective immediately. A quiet breath escaped him. Not sorrow, not fear. It was the sound of an engine turning over after years of silence. Trigger conditions, nearly met. The memo confirming Phase 1 rolled silently across the HR dashboard, like a death sentence dressed in corporate language. Johnston closed the screen and continued down the hallway, each mop stroke echoing against the marble floor like the ticking of an old clock nearing its final chime. Around him, the true state of Adams Automotive revealed itself, not in numbers or charts, but in whispers, locked doors, and the hollow laughter of men who believed money could hide rot. In the executive lounge, a group huddled around a touchscreen coffee machine worth more than a factory worker's yearly wage. "We're replacing the cafeteria machines with the new European line," one director bragged. "It elevates the brand atmosphere." "And the labor budget?" another asked casually. "Cut by 12%. No one cares where the money comes from, as long as the lattes have foam." Laughter. Perfect, polished, empty. A digital notice flashed on the wall. Effective immediately. Line workers shall use rear entrance, front atrium, reserved for client-facing personnel and executives. Johnston paused mid-swipe at the edge of the lounge, expression still calm. But his eyes, those eyes that had seen war, loss, rebirth, reflected quiet disappointment. This was no longer the company he had built. It had become a monument of ego, polished to a mirror shine, hollow beneath. Inside Clara Voss's glass office, tension brewed. Julia Bennett stood across from her, clutching a folder of payroll discrepancies. "These adjustments you're approving," Julia said carefully. "They slash the lower-tier wages while executive bonuses are climbing. Some floor workers can't even afford transportation. This violates our original—" Clara slammed the folder shut. "You're a junior accountant, Julia, not a policymaker. If you want a future here, focus on numbers, not ethics." Julia's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "The company was founded on ethics," she replied, "not exploitation." Clara stepped closer, voice icy. "Keep pushing this narrative, and your badge won't unlock these doors next week." Meanwhile, in the assembly bay, chaos erupted. A robotic arm had jammed mid-cycle, sending sparks across the line. Engineers frantically attempted overrides, but nothing worked. The mechanic supervisor, Tariq, shouted for everyone to stand clear. Then, without a word, Johnston stepped forward. He pressed 3 points on the control panel: tap, press, hold, then reached beneath the arm and released a pressure valve only the original spec manuals mentioned. The machine stuttered, then purred back to life. Tariq stared, stunned. "How did you—" Johnston simply said, "You were over-tightening your torque sequence, 3 taps, not 4. He showed the rhythm with his fingertips. It was the same rhythm he had written into the first prototype decades ago. Tariq swallowed. "No one does it that way anymore." "They should," Johnston replied quietly, "if they want it to last." That afternoon, when the executive conference room emptied for lunch, Johnston wheeled his mop bucket inside, but he wasn't there to clean. His fingers slipped beneath the polished conference table edge and pressed a hidden panel, one he had built himself all those years ago. It clicked open, revealing a slender channel wired for audio capture, a legacy security feature never removed because no one knew it existed. He activated it. The recorder began its silent vigil. Moments later, in the CEO's office, his old admin backdoor flickered to life through a maintenance terminal. Files, emails, recordings, all streamed to an encrypted drive. Every lie, every stolen pension, every buried complaint, they would all surface soon. In his top-floor office, Richard Hale flipped open his sleek tablet, scanned an agenda, and smiled. Friday, board vote, agenda item 4, janitorial division, full termination, outsource proposal. He tapped the signature line with a flourish. Legacy, he muttered to himself, is a liability. What he signed was his own undoing. The building's glass exterior reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror, but inside, shadows were forming, legal, silent, irreversible. Richard Hale believed he had signed a routine cost-saving measure. What he had truly done was place his hand on a hidden lever that would change the fate of the company forever. Johnston continued his slow routine through the hallways, mop gliding over polished marble. But this time, someone was waiting. Julia Bennett stood at the corner near the freight elevator, clutching a folder to her chest. Her eyes darted nervously as she stepped forward. "Sir," she whispered, I I probably shouldn't be doing this, but you need to see it." She pressed the folder into his hands. The cover page bore the title, Resolution Proposal. Termination of Legacy Facilities, Staff Effective Upon Board Approval. She didn't wait for thanks. She only looked at him with quiet urgency and respect. Johnston gave a single nod. It said everything. He entered a supply storage room, the one no one used anymore, where the original factory schematics still hung beneath stacks of unused equipment. In the far corner, he knelt and slid aside a crate of outdated signage. A battered metal lockbox waited beneath. His fingers, steady as ever, spun the dial. Click. Inside lay the bones of the company's true soul. Original bylaws. Written not by lawyers, but by builders. Trust addendums, stamped with embossed seals from the Aegis Private Banking Consortium. A fountain pen, heavy, elegant, engraved with 2 letters, J.A. Johnston placed the termination resolution beside these relics, and the past and present collided like gears locking into place. He pulled out a single parchment from the trust record, yellowed with age. It was the clause he had written with Victor Hale beside him, when neither of them could have imagined what greed would one day grow into. Founders' Dignity Protections. Clause 11b. Should any founding partner, in any employment capacity, be it executive, consultant, or facilities, be forcibly terminated or stripped of duty, operational control shall immediately revert to the surviving founder or primary trust beneficiary. He reached into his coverall pocket and removed his worn ID badge. On the back, almost faded with time, Employee Class, Legacy, Facilities, Founders Tier. The disguise was not a retreat, it was a trigger. As dusk cloaked the city, Johnston made a quiet phone call from an unregistered maintenance terminal. A calm voice answered. "Aegis Trust, this line is protected." "This is Johnston Adams," he replied. A pause. Then the voice softened with reverence. "Mr. Adams? We have been awaiting your call. They're voting Friday, full termination." Confirmation came immediately. If they vote yes, you are back, instantly. Full operational control. The trust activates, and the board is dissolved, pending review. Johnston's gaze drifted toward the window, where factory lights shimmered in the distance. Then it's time. Before leaving, he stopped at the employee cafeteria, where 2 cleaners, both older than the machines they tended, sat alone. Moments earlier, they had been caught on security camera being mocked by executives. Johnston placed 2 hot meals in front of them. One of the men tried to stand. "Sir, we can't." "You can," Johnston said gently. "Eat." As they bowed their heads in gratitude, he quietly folded their termination letters and placed them in his inner pocket. Evidence, stories, lives he intended to fight for. Back in the hallway, a chime echoed from the display panel on the wall. Board calendar notification, emergency vote, scheduled, 8:00 a.m., boardroom. A agenda, legacy facilities, employee termination. Johnston stared at it. The clock had finally struck. True wealth does not shout. It watches, waits, and then takes back everything that was built with its own hands. Stay with me, Wealthnaire family, because the real storm begins at sunrise. Morning arrived with the polished chill of glass and the hollow promise of power. The boardroom gleamed like a surgical theater. Bright lights, chrome fixtures, and an oval table where fortunes were decided with the flick of a pen. Richard Hale stood at the head, confident as a king. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing to a sleek presentation on the screen. "Today we undertake a necessary evolution. We are moving this company into a fully automated future. Legacy roles are draining revenue. Efficiency is the new loyalty." Clara Voss stepped up next, tapping the screen. Graphs and projections danced in neon blue. Our AI sanitation models show a 300% increase in cleaning efficiency, she said smugly, and zero emotional complaints. A few board members laughed. One joked, "Machines don't need lunch breaks or cry in supply closets." Laughter rippled. The entire room echoed with superiority, the kind that forgets its roots. Richard leaned in, eyes cold. "The motion on the table is to terminate all janitorial personnel effective immediately and outsource remaining duties to automation providers." A hand rose at the end of the table. Julia Bennett stood, palms trembling slightly as she held a paper. "Before any vote," she said, voice steadying, "the board needs to review compliance regulations attached to legacy employee classifications. According to bylaws from the founding charter, section—" "That's enough," Clara snapped. "I have the documents," Julia pushed forward. "Removing this class of employee triggers." "Security," Richard said without looking at her. "Escort Ms. Bennett outside until the vote is complete." 2 guards approached. Julia's eyes swept across the room. No one met her gaze. She turned once, and her eyes found Johnston standing in the hallway beyond the glass. He nodded at her, once, as if to say, "You've done enough." The heavy doors closed behind her. Richard raised the gavel with a theatrical flourish. "All in favor?" Hands shot up without hesitation. Some even smiled as their wrists lifted, as though they were voting away dust, not people. Richard slammed the gavel. "Motion passed. Effective immediately." Ping. A sharp tone cut through the speakers. Clara frowned, tapping her tablet. A red icon pulsed in the corner of her HR dashboard. "Founders Protection Violation Detected. Immediate Trust Protocol in Motion." "What is this?" she muttered, clicking. Another alert popped up. "Beneficial ownership transfer. Engaged 51% control. Johnston A. Adams. Activation. Irreversible." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Richard, what is this?" Richard frowned. "Glitch. Just override it." She shook her head, panic rising. "It won't let me. I can't access the controls." A second ping echoed, this time from Johnston's phone. "Aegis Trust. Activation in progress. Prepare to assume control." Johnston closed the notification softly. His face remained completely calm, like a man who had seen the storm coming long before the clouds gathered. Inside the boardroom, murmurs turned to alarm. "What does it mean, Johnston Adams?" a director asked. "Isn't he dead? Is this legal?" Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Lock down IT systems. Cut server access, now." Clara's fingers flew over the tablet. "I can't. It's transferring admin privileges. Oh my God." Outside, through the glass walls, the first media vans rolled onto the main campus road. Satellite dishes unfolded like mechanical flowers tracking a signal. Sirens wailed in the distance, not of danger, but of revelation. The building itself seemed to exhale. For years, it had been silent, patient, waiting for the moment the steel would remember its maker. And now, it had. The boardroom doors burst open, not with force, but with the kind of quiet authority that bends the air around it. Every conversation died. Richard Hale, mid-sentence and halfway through barking orders, froze as his eyes locked onto the figure standing in the doorway. Johnston Adams? Gone was the worn janitor's uniform. In its place, a charcoal suit, flawless, tailored, dignified. His shoulders were square, his steps unhurried. His gray hair, once hidden by a frayed cap, was combed back neatly. Behind him walked 2 men in dark suits, the trustees from Aegis Private Banking, and a state corporate regulator holding a leather briefcase. Following last was the company's own press liaison, already streaming live on the internal broadcast to every screen in the complex. Johnston did not look at Richard. His eyes went instead to the company emblem on the wall, the emblem he had once carved into a wooden sign with his own hands. "Good morning," he said softly. The regulator cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he announced, "we are here to recognize Mr. Johnston Alexander Adams as the primary and majority beneficial owner of Adams Automotive International, holding 51% under the Aegis Trust." A ripple of stunned gasps shot through the room. "That's impossible," Clara choked out. "He's a janitor." One of the trustees stepped forward, setting a heavy envelope on the boardroom table. He drew out document after document: trust deeds with embossed seals, the original bylaws signed in ink, activation logs stamped with legal time codes, board minutes acknowledging the founder protection clauses. Then the trustee pressed play on a video tablet. Victor Hale, Richard's own father, appeared on screen, much younger, standing beside Johnston in that first tin roof factory. "In the event of my incapacitation or betrayal of founding charter values," Victor's recorded voice said clearly, "I affirm that full control of Adams Automotive reverts to its creator, Johnston Adams, whose hands built its first engine, whose vision built its future." Richard staggered back a step, color draining from his face. This is outdated," he began. "No," Trust Counsel interrupted. "This was reaffirmed and sealed in 1998 and again in 2008. Legally binding, irrevocable." Richard tried again. "We need to vote on this." "Not today," the state regulator said firmly. "Founders' rights supersede board procedure." On every monitor across the campus, factory workers, mechanics, receptionists, and night shift crews watched in stunned silence. The janitor they had seen every morning was standing at the head of the table, the rightful owner. Julia watched from the hallway, tears in her eyes. Johnston stepped forward. For a moment, he simply rested his palm on the back of the founder's chair. His voice was steady, almost gentle. "This company was not built from profits or projections," he said. "It was built from broken hands that needed purpose. These walls were not raised by executives, but by people who believed in work with dignity." No one dared move. Slowly, deliberately, Johnston pulled out the chair. Trust Counsel spoke in formal tone. "Mr. Adams, please take your seat." And he did. For the first time in decades, the founder sat at the head of his own table. The press liaison turned the camera toward the door at Johnston's signal. A line of janitors, mechanics, and maintenance staff stepped in. Workers once mocked, now walking in with heads high. They formed a row along the back wall, silent but unbroken. Johnston stood. He lifted his hand toward the founder's portraits, toward his own name, once covered in dust, now shining under the lights. "Let's begin," he said. The age of polished boots had ended. The age of the builder had returned. The air in the boardroom shifted, not with noise, but with truth. The walls that once echoed with polished laughter were now witnesses to consequences long overdue. Johnston sat at the head of the table, the founder's chair reclaiming its rightful occupant. Before him, a large screen displayed documents, financial trails, video evidence, and whistleblower reports that had been suppressed for years. The trustees began the cascade. "Exhibit A," Counsel announced. Pension funds diverted to offshore accounts. Rows of numbers appeared. Money meant for factory workers' retirements funneled through shadow corporations in the Caymans. Factory workers watching on the live feed covered their mouths in disbelief. Exhibit B. Vendor kickbacks. Richard Hale had awarded inflated contracts in exchange for personal bonuses, disguised as consulting fees. Millions stolen. Clara Voss shifted in her seat as another screen lit up. Exhibit C. AI sanitation systems. Purchased from a shell company registered under Clara's cousin's name. No competitive bidding. Triple market price. Systems never installed. Money pocketed. Clara stood abruptly. "This is a misinterpretation." Johnston raised his hand calmly. She fell silent. More files appeared. Unauthorized executive wellness retreats in luxury beach resorts. Private jets billed as supplier inspections, all paid from company emergency funds, while line workers were denied medical leave. Richard tried to recover. These were strategic investments. Johnston activated another video. A quality assurance supervisor appeared on screen. With trembling voice, she admitted, "Richard Hale threatened to blacklist my entire team if we reported engine failures. We buried warranty claims to avoid recalls." The room erupted, not in noise, but in stunned silence. Then the moment of reckoning began. Johnston stood. "There are two kinds of people in this company," he said quietly. "Those who built and those who bled it." He turned to Clara. "Do you admit your actions?" he asked. Her lips parted, breath shallow. I was following directives." "No," Johnston replied gently. "You were writing them." She sank back in her chair. Two security officers entered quietly and escorted her out. Next came Richard. Johnston met his eyes for the first time. "You inherited a legacy," he said, "and called it your invention. You mistook power for ownership and wealth for worth." Richard stood, fists clenched. "You can't do this. The board will—" "There is no board," the trust council reminded. "There is only the founder." Regulators entered. Richard's defiance broke as they placed a hand on his shoulder. Johnston didn't raise his voice, not once. "Justice is not vengeance," he said. "It is the restoration of order." As Richard was escorted away, the employees watching across the facility erupted, not in cheers, but in relief. Then Johnston turned to Julia. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "please return to your seat at this table." She hesitated, stunned, then stepped forward. "With immediate effect, you are appointed Vice President of Fair Practices and Stewardship. Your responsibility will be to guard the soul of this company." Julia's eyes glistened. "I won't fail you, sir." "You won't be serving me," he said. "You'll be serving them." He gestured to the screens filled with faces of workers across every department. Johnston placed both hands on the table. "This company began with hands," he declared. "It will be led by hands again." Hope bloomed across the factory floors like sunlight through storm clouds. As the boardroom emptied, the press liaison stepped forward. "Mr. Adams," she said softly, "the world is watching. They're requesting a global statement at sunrise." He looked toward the massive factory windows where the lights flickered like stars across steel. In the reflection, he saw not his own face, but Mara's. A promise was calling. Power is not in titles, nor in suits. It lies in integrity. Quiet, patient, unstoppable. The world is about to hear the truth from the man they thought was invisible. The early morning light spilled across the factory floor, not cold and sterile as before, but golden, hopeful. The great assembly hall, once silent under oppressive management, now surged with anticipation. Workers filled every aisle, sleeves rolled, eyes bright. They weren't gathered by order. They came because the man who built their future had come home. Johnston Adams walked slowly through the center aisle, not as a janitor, not as an executive, but as the architect of every bolt, every dream, every paycheck that ever fed a household. He paused at the oldest line in the building, Line 1, where Eden Line's first chassis was once stamped into existence. Though it had long been decommissioned, the original hydraulic press still stood at the far end, draped in dust, like a relic sleeping beneath history. Johnston placed his palm against the steel. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and then softly he knocked. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The old rhythm. The torque test he'd taught his first team decades ago. A hush fell across the floor. Tariq, the young mechanic, whispered aloud, "That's the rhythm my grandfather told me about." Johnston turned and smiled. This press, he said, voice carrying across the hall, was never just a machine. It listened. It responded. It breathed with us. Because the hands that built it believed in what they were building. Applause broke, not loud and chaotic, but deep, emotional, like thunder rolling across mountains. Johnston stood on a raised platform as the trustees presented the new company charter. Effective immediately, Johnston declared, 30% of annual profits will be allocated to the Adams Foundation. Screens lit up across the hall, displaying the foundation's pillars: scholarships for employees' children, medical debt relief, housing for the homeless, support for veterans and widowed parents. Gasps turned into cheers. Next, Johnston continued, a living wage floor is now company law. No employee will earn $1 less than what provides real dignity, and all hourly staff will receive quarterly profit sharing. An old mechanic wiped tears from his face. He wasn't alone. And finally, Johnston said, turning toward the front entrance visible through the glass walls, these doors. He gestured to the towering main doors used only for executives and privileged guests, will now be open to every single employee. Factory workers looked at each other in disbelief. For too long, Johnston said, we have mistaken titles for worth. No more. This company belongs to the hands that keep it alive. At that moment, Julia stepped forward, holding a covered object. With a nod from Johnston, she unveiled it. A janitor's bucket, old, stained, worn, mounted on a pedestal. Engraved beneath it, respect begins here. The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, some openly weeping. But Johnston slipped away quietly, stepping into the lobby alcove where the memorial wall stood. A photograph of Mara, smiling gently, was framed in light. Julia joined him and placed a single white lily at the base of the frame. She saw this day, Julia whispered. Johnston's voice was soft. She dreamed it louder than I ever could. As they turned to leave, they noticed a small figure standing near the edge of the display. A boy, roughly 10, holding a toy wrench in his small fist. His father, Tariq, stood behind him, watching with pride. The boy lifted the wrench to his forehead in a quiet salute. Mr. Adams, he asked shyly, can I build one too? Johnston knelt so their eyes were level. Tomorrow, he said, smiling. Bring your goggles. The future answered with a spark. The next morning, the world watched. Not from a glass tower, not from a stage lit with artificial spotlights, but from the heart of the factory floor, the very ground where Adams Automotive had been born. Johnston Adams stepped onto a small platform beside the original Eden Line chassis. Cameras streamed across every continent. Workers stood in rows, not as employees, but as witnesses to a legacy reclaimed. He began, not with grandeur, but with truth. When I walked back into this company, he said gently, I did not come as a founder or as an owner. I came as a janitor, because titles are easy to see. But character? Character is only revealed when the world thinks you are no one. He rested his hand on the old steel chassis. I needed to see who saw, who held this company's values in their actions, not just their words. Some chose pride, others chose people. That is why we are standing here, reborn. A wave of applause rose, not deafening, but deep. Resonant, rising like a heartbeat shared. Across the factory floor, announcements began. Line supervisor Mrs. Lawson, who had worked night shifts for 32 years, was named Director of Operations Apprenticeship. Receptionist Amelia Brooks, who had always greeted employees with warmth even when executives ignored her, was appointed Head of Employee Relations. Night cleaner Ezekiel Turner, whose daughter had been denied medical coverage by former HR, stepped forward as the first beneficiary of the Adams Foundation and the new facilities representative on the Leadership Council. Tears glistened in eyes hardened by years of quiet endurance. For the first time, leadership wasn't being replaced. It was being restored. At the far end of the building, the last group of dismissed executives walked toward the doors, flanked by regulators. No boos, no shouts. Instead, the factory workers formed a silent corridor, standing respectfully, not to honor the fallen leaders, but to honor the dignity of justice done without malice. Richard Hale paused at the threshold, turning back to look at Johnston. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, but there was nothing left to say. He lowered his head and stepped out into the daylight. The doors closed softly behind him. Later that morning, Johnston walked into the new Founders Museum, once a sterile hall of forgotten plaques. Now it was alive with photographs of workers, handwritten notes of gratitude, and tools mounted like treasures. At the center stood the pedestal. Upon it, the old janitor's bucket. Beside it, a brass hook. Johnston removed his coverall, the one with stains from floor polish, engine grease, and years of silent observation. He smoothed it once with his palm. The camera leaned in as he hung the coverall gently, stitched on the inside collar, in faded thread. J.A., a symbol, a reminder. Greatness doesn't announce itself, it serves. He turned back toward the crowd gathered in the museum, his eyes steady. Wealth that shouts is brittle. Wealth that builds lasts. As applause rose again, the camera pulled back, showing not a CEO, not a billionaire, but a builder standing among his people. A man who had regained not just his company, but its soul. Thanks for watching, family. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. Never judge the hands that built your world.